I'm Paul Brierley. I run the University of Arizona's Yuma Center of Excellence for Desert Agriculture. Appreciate you coming to our session. We want to tell you about sort of the project that we have and the results that we're getting, because we've been at it for a while, and the results are interesting. So, in case you're in the wrong room, this is about the work we've done to do quantitative assessments of water and salt balance, the water that each crop needs and uses, and the impact that has on the salinity in the soil, right? So we've got quite a team, and not everybody's listed. I just have listed the presenters here today who are going to speak with you. I'm just going to kind of introduce the project, and then we're going to get right into the people who are doing the work, getting the results, and certainly want it to be interactive if you have questions or thoughts on it. But it'll be me introducing the project, and then Dr. Andy French is going to come in remotely. They still have travel limitations at USDA. So he's going to talk about the water use part of the project. And then Dr. Charlie Sanchez is here to talk about the soil salinity part. And then we have Toby Torrey from U of A, and he'll be coming in remotely also from Tucson. And they are developing a mobile app that will utilize all this information and real-time weather and let people track, get recommendations on irrigating and tracking the soil salt balance, so that and that's over not just a crop but over time, so you know where you're at on what you need to do for leaching. So where did this come from? You start in the top left there. Back in about 2015, U of A and Department of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation and the irrigation districts, a whole bunch of people worked together and did this case study in efficiency. It was something where they quantified really what were the sources of water, how did they get distributed out to the farms, what was produced with them, and what kind of efficiencies have been put in place over the last 40 years. And it really was a useful document, especially when it came to public policy. And as you all know, water is at the forefront of public policy right now. Right? And without some quantification, it's easy for policymakers in Phoenix or LA or whatever to just look at it and say, well, they're just farming in the desert, that's a waste of water, let's use it somewhere else. So this really made them realize how productive, how efficient production is here in the use of water, what it does, and that this really is a good place to use water. But it also generated a lot of questions. You know, how much water does each crop need? What impact does it have on soil salinity? What are different crop rotations? How does that impact things? And then there's this practice of pre-season irrigation, right, where you do the flat water irrigation. That doesn't look real good to somebody driving by on the road. It's 115 degrees out, you got bare dirt, and you're flooding it with water. An easy response would be, well, just don't do that, right? You can save water by not doing that. So questions like that needed to be answered quantitatively. So the Yuma County Ag Water Coalition, which is a grouping of the irrigation districts, came to us and said, can you put together a project that would address these things and give us some scientific data? How can we be more efficient? How can we show the efficiency that we're working under? And how can we help agronomically? You know, how can we make recommendations that'll let the crops be as productive as possible, but as efficient as possible? Little did we know back then what this would bloom into. Charlie was, you know, our main researcher who was part of the project from the start. He brought in Andy French, and Andy had a couple eddy covariance systems, which they'll talk about, but very accurate way, but very expensive and very much a pain in the behind as far as getting out of the way. And Mazen's here, who leads the team that takes that out of the field every time there's going to be a planting or cultivation or any kind of, you know, any operation that it's going to be in the way, and then get it back in there. Sometimes it has to get back in there. As you know, the transplants go in at 3 in the morning, the water's coming at 7 in the morning, and they got to get it in between so we don't miss anything. So so we started with the two when Andy French came on the team from Maricopa at the USDA, and it blossomed to where we have 9 at one time, Charlie? Yeah, we've had 9 of these eddy covariance systems out, along with large aperture scintillometers, different things we can show you. But the point is, instead of measuring a couple crops per year, we now are able to measure a lot and get a lot of repetitions to make sure our data is really good and really solid. So we put together this team with Charlie from the U of A and Andy from USDA, and then Andy brought in researchers from NASA, and we have the team on the ground. We got support from that list there, different, the irrigation districts, different growers and cooperators. The Bureau of Reclamation came on as a really, really big supporter. And each of these entities had their own sort of, what were they looking for, right? So the Bureau of Reclamation, I think Andy will probably talk about, but they have to estimate what crops are using and where all the water's being used, what are the crop coefficients as they manage the river. Of course, USDA, the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program, the different commodity councils, lettuce, citrus, wheat, supported this. The experiment stations and some extra funds they had bought some equipment. Cotton, Incorporated, NASA, and even California Department of Ag. So it's a big umbrella that we kept this group together, where everybody was funding and getting the results that they needed, but able to use the base team that we had to gather all this information to really tell us what, again, the crop water use hadn't been updated in 50 years in a lot of cases. Of course, you guys know the varieties have changed. Some of them are producing twice what they used to produce. So we didn't have good water numbers on that of what each crop's going to use. And that's important for a lot of reasons. It's important agronomically, so you know what the crop needs. It's important if somebody's talking about maybe fallowing ground and saving that water for the river. And you want that to be an accurate amount that they're calculating, or you're going to put even more pressure on the river. And then you want to know what the impacts are of that irrigation on salinity. And Charlie's going to get into, there's such a thing as watering too efficiently, and we actually do a lot of that in Yuma. Too efficiently meaning you're not pushing the salts down, and so it's not sustainable. So we wanted to get the science behind that and know which crops were adding salts to the soil, which were leaching the salts, and what's left over, and what do you need to do to make up that difference. So this involved a lot of technology with remote sensing, both the equipment I've been talking about, satellites, drones, and it's ultimately ending up in new data, the new crop coefficients and all the data that they've collected, along with a tool, this app that you're going to hear about that's very close to sort of beta use, to use out and make recommendations on when and how much water you need to irrigate, and again, to keep track of the soil salinity so that you worry about that. Any questions on the overall picture? So I think I've covered most of this. Questions are, how much water do they use? Impact on salinity. Again, it addresses the need for that preseason irrigation. You look at things like fallowing and drip and what impact do those have, and what, especially with salinity. It's a real easy solution for people to say, well, you should use drip, or you can fallow and then come back in with another crop. And we wanted to look at what are the impacts of that, and what does it take to come back in. Yes, sir. Well, you explained this before, but preseason crop water irrigation, is that to push the salt down, or are there other reasons? There's other reasons. So, a good question. So you guys all know, you do the flat water irrigation before the vegetable crop goes in. It does have benefits like weeds, diseases, and then in addition, pushing the salts down. So throughout the year, if you're irrigating too efficiently and you're not putting enough of a leaching fraction in, then the salts build up in the root zone, and crops like lettuce and whatnot aren't going to grow. So if there were not other reasons, our tool would tell you whether you need to and how much you need to do in that irrigation for leaching. But there are other reasons that you do it too. So basically we, like I say, out in the field, have been out there with this equipment, measuring 17 different crops, plus measuring what happens with a fallow field, because it doesn't just sit in a steady state. And Charlie will talk about that. Along with that, looking at the soil salinity impacts and utilizing remote sensing, especially satellites, is something that Andy really brings to the table. And we've done a lot of ground truthing with drones and whatnot to really know what are we being told when we get the data from the satellites, and how can we then integrate that in to management systems. And then, of course, it's key to get the information out, both so agronomists can use it, so other researchers can use it, and so it's there for public policy decisions also. And then that app, we're hoping that becomes a really useful tool for producers. So this is just an example, or some examples of when we talk about measuring the measurements that we've done. If you start down here, you've got things on the ground where you're taking samples. You've got measuring devices, monitors, on up to, these are the eddy covariance systems I was talking about. It's taking all sorts of measurements and salinity measurements. This is a large aperture scintillometer that covers more of a regional area, looking at evapotranspiration. And then the drones and aerial sensors I talked about. And then different satellites. That's something else Dr. French brought, is some of these new satellites really have excellent sensors that are giving higher resolution. The satellites come over more often. And so that's an exciting area that some of them are only able to do particular sections of Earth as they go around. And thanks to Dr. French, Yuma is one of those areas that they've been covering. And then the last section today, we'll talk about this app that's being developed. DesertAgWISE, which stands for Water, Irrigation, Soil, and Environment. And by the way, on the way in, there was a clipboard, which I might pass around again after we get to the app part. But we're looking for people that might be interested to be an early user of this app and try it out and give us feedback. So with that, are there any questions for me or about the project before we turn it over to Dr. French? I should have had his bio with me. I don't, but this is Dr. Andrew French. He's from the USDA's Ag Research Services Aridland's Ag Research Center up at Maricopa. And he's spent the last 6 years with us. So, and I didn't mention much about our center, but Yuma Center of Excellence for Desert Agriculture is this public-private partnership between the ag industry and the university. And one of the things that we do is try to bring researchers here to address the issues that need addressing in Yuma. And Dr. French is a good example of that, where we engaged him in this, not just this project, but mainly this project. And he has really flourished down here in Yuma because he found places where he could apply his knowledge, his technology. And like I say, he spent a lot of time on this effort, where before this he had never worked in Yuma. It had all been in Central Arizona. So we can see it now, Andy. I'll let you go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you, Paul, for the kind words, and my apologies for not being there in person. I really don't care for Zoom that much, but this is my option right now. The three main authors of this work are listed: myself, Charles, who's in the room with you, and I hope Mason is there too. But we've also had a big team of workers, technicians, scientists, programmers, affiliates elsewhere that have made this possible. As Paul said, we're looking at water use and management for the Yuma irrigation districts, but the scope of the project is actually a little bit larger. The hope is that the results we get out of this study are more generally applicable for the U.S. Southwest irrigated agriculture. Paul's also mentioned the contributors. I mean, so in addition to University of Arizona and USDA, and of course YCEDA, we've had some major contributors. First of all, the Bureau of Reclamation made all of this possible financially, and their support has continued up until this time. The Water Coalition, of course, has been pivotal in our access Arizona grain research, especially for wheat. The French and Israeli Space Agency has been important for satellite data, as illustrated on the left-hand side. There's a Venus satellite. The Venus, by the way, has nothing to do with the planet, but has everything to do with the name of vegetation in French. And that's an example of the data that were collected for a year and a half over Yuma. And NASA JPL has been a major contributor. I've been on the NASA EcoStress science team, which is the thermal infrared satellite on the space station. And that monitors land surface temperature, particularly of plants. They've also contributed 2 eddy covariance stations, and they've kindly lent them for us for almost the entire duration of the experiment. NASA Goddard Space Flight Center has also contributed intellectual knowledge and modeling expertise. So the project objectives, to reiterate, are essentially these. First of all, we want to update the water use by all economically significant crops in the Yuma Valley. What that means is that a lot of the data that you have at your disposal come from as long ago as 1950s and 1960s. Leonard Erie in particular has published some work. And a lot of that data didn't come from Yuma, it came from Mesa, for example. Those data are very high quality data, well conducted experiments and studies using gravimetric methods, taking soil samples. But cropping practices have changed, crop varieties have changed, and it's really important to know how much water the crops are using. Even if the numbers come out very close to what Leonard Erie had, you need to document what they are today if you're going to get involved with decisions about the crops you grow, when you grow them, and also negotiations with different districts. The second point is we want to integrate remote sensing to improve water use mapping. I'm sure most of growers don't use remote sensing much at all, except maybe for problems. But the fact is, remote sensing data, especially in the Yuma Valley, is widespread, very high quality, and can be very useful if you have the tools to be able to use it. It can improve your understanding of crop density and also crop water use at the field scale, in fact, at the subfield scale. Recent data from Planet Corporation, which is a commercial provider, gives you data at 1 meter resolution, but you can get free satellite data from USGS Landsat and also from the French Space Agency, CNES, Sentinel-2, European Space Agency, gives you 10-meter data that's quite adequate for most of the fields in Yuma Valley. Third point is the crop coefficients. Again, this may not be common practice for growers in Yuma Valley, but crop coefficients, as I'll demonstrate, could be a practical tool for you to manage growing crops, manage your water, but it's also a practical tool for water management, such as reclamation. Tracking salts, of course, is very important. I won't discuss that. Dr. Sanchez will follow me. And then Toby Torrey will finish with the advisory app that will guide the water management and make it easy to integrate our knowledge with your local knowledge. So the stakeholders, obviously, Yuma focused, not exclusively Yuma, but here they are, 7 irrigation districts. The top image shows the irrigation districts in Google Earth image, just to emphasize the high contrast between the surrounding desert landscape and the irrigated agriculture, and then the 7 districts down below. So eddy covariance. It's not the only way to measure crop water use and evapotranspiration. There are other ways. You can certainly put in soil neutron probes, for example, or moisture probes and measure soil moisture and do the modeling that way. You can put in lysimeters. You can take gravimetric samples the way Leonard Erie does. But the difficulty with those, they are slow, laborious, and not spatially representative. Eddy covariance is a technique that has emerged in the last couple of decades and exceeds on almost all the counts for getting crop water use. The station is deployed on the left-hand side illustrates what's involved. It consists, this in particular, this shows a tripod out in the field with data loggers. On the red circles shows the acoustic sensor, which measures the wind speed, wind direction, air temperature, and humidity. And then in the background, our solar panels provide power. So logistically, a little tricky to put in and out of the field, but provides excellent quality data for crop water use. We have 9 eddy covariance stations. 3 are owned by USDA, 3 owned by University of Arizona, and then a couple more by NASA JPL. We quite a fleet. We've occupied 77 sites since fall of 2016, as illustrated on the upper right-hand side there, showing the colors, colors indicating the different regions within the Yuma Valley. And we've explored many crops here, at least 16 key crops, 17 crops. And we've replicated the sites so that we don't have just one study site, one crop, and base the numbers on that. Here's a little bit of details of what eddy covariance does. It's complicated, noisy data to look at. We collect observations at 20 hertz and then block average those every 30 minutes. And then we further block average those to daily time steps. A typical daily plot of that is on the left-hand side. This is wheat, to show you how the beginning of the season, this DOI is day of year. So in this case, it's planted at the very end of December and harvested in April, May. The red curve shows you what's called potential evapotranspiration, which I'll show a little bit more of later. And that gives you a way of comparing the actual evapotranspiration to crop water use versus a standardized evaporation rate. And so the black samples show you the high variability from day to day. On the bottom shows the irrigation events in blue, which are obviously quite discrete. Rainfall events, which are much rarer, shown in green. We bring all that together and accumulate that to give total water use. So there's some issues with eddy covariance that I have discussed in prior years, and one of them is energy balance closure. So, every method has an Achilles heel, and this is one of them. Eddy covariance measures essentially 4 components. It measures the incoming radiation from the sun and the atmosphere, radiation that goes into the soil, and then it measures what's called advective energy, which is the sensible heat flux based on temperature gradients and vapor pressure gradients. When you add all that up, the number by the equation should equal 0. Well, they don't. Usually we have what's called closure error, which means that when you solve the energy balance equation and you plot that up, you typically have a 10 to 20% closure error, which means you have to plug that gap, because the formulations say that if you don't close it, you've got some energy leakage in your equations. And where is that going? Is it going into sensible heat flux, which is not particularly germane to our studies, or is it going into evaporation of water, which is exactly what we need? On that upper right-hand graph shows a display of the energy balance closure for one of the stations we have for lettuce, and it shows an R-squared around 0.93, which shows you that the energy balance closure is very good. It means less than 10% closure error. This is quite encouraging, but we don't always get that high closure. Another Achilles heel is what we call flux footprint, down in the lower right. Here I've grabbed a satellite image near the very end of the lettuce season. So you see where the black contour lines are, and you see lots of striping. That means they've been doing some harvesting. So it's really at the very end of the season and not in uniform conditions. And the tiny little blob in the center there shows you what are called a heat map of the eddy covariance station. So on most days, the flux footprint has what I would call a log normal distribution, which means that most of the signal that we're measuring by the station is not immediately at the station, but maybe 10, 20 yards upwind from the station. And then it tapers off with a long tail. On some days, we don't have sufficient atmospheric instability, which is convection action. And the flux footprint can fall outside the field of interest. And that shows here in that outer contour that on rare days, we have the energy coming in from a field entirely differently from what we're interested in. So that's a problem. We have to make sure that we don't add up water used from outside our field of interest. We only include the data within the field. And this flux footprint mapping routine keeps track of that and allows us to eliminate those events that are extraneous. We've looked at today, we've looked at 17 crops plus fallowed land starting in fall of 2016. They're listed here. Some of these are longer season crops like cotton. We can go in and stay there for several months, and other crops are very short, 30, 40 days like spinach. So we've done all of these crops. Some of these we've just started like citrus. We've just finishing celery. We've done only a few examples of fallow. And we're also just really in the first year plus at looking at alfalfa. So I'll go through about 6 different crops, but the analysis would be similar. In this case, I'm looking at durum wheat. We had 7 sites. We published these results in Agricultural Water Management in 2020. And on the second column, you see the evapotranspiration, which we derive from the eddy covariance, showing you 500 to 600 millimeters of water. And then we have the yield. And then we have the actual irrigation. Unfortunately, label's missing there. And then on the right-hand side of the soils, let me add parenthetically, every year I get taken to task for neglecting to talk about soils. Let me say this. We are concerned about soils in 2 levels. We look at the shallow soil levels in order to close the energy budget. So we look at the soil moisture within the top few centimeters, and that helps us determine the heat capacity, and that is subtracted from the net radiation, helps us figure out how much water is evaporated. We look at the deeper soil profile in order to do the soil water balance model, which in this case is supported results that we have here for durum wheat. So I mentioned the soil types. We've collected soil types at every site we visited. I don't explicitly mention the soil textures and soil types, but I want you to know that that's definitely part of the regimen. Here's some examples from the eddy covariance showing you the daily evapotranspiration at 4 sites. It shows the daily variation quite high in black. The red curve shows you what are called the estimated KC, the single crop coefficient curve. So I'll explain this in a few more slides, but that's a trapezoidal function that allows you to simplify this daily evapotranspiration and get cumulative or daily water use. And the green curve shows you the experimental crop coefficient. So the red is essentially a smooth version of the green curve. Watermelon is something we haven't reported previously. It's a very interesting crop to look at because of plastic mulch, which means that that early season you have very little evaporation, which also means that the satellite remote sensing data using vegetation indices can be very, very effective, as illustrated here in the left-hand side. So the red-orange color shows you the potential evapotranspiration, which is around 8 to 11 millimeters per day. And the green, well, there's sort of a olive green, which is the measured eddy covariance, ET. And then overlaying on that is the single crop coefficient, more of a, I don't know how to describe that green, but unfortunately they plot on each other. Actually, it's very fortunate, because what it says is that satellite remote sensing data is a very good predictor of crop water use. The actual vegetation disease is plotted in purple here. And what this shows you is the actual crop cover throughout the season. So this was quite unusual to me, because you have planting in February, March, and then it takes a while for the crop to emerge, and it rapidly grows and gets a peak around day 150, which is, I guess, what late April, May, something like that. And they do some harvest, and then that vegetation decreases around day 175, but then it comes back up. So there's a second harvest, and that vegetation is picked up by the satellite data. A very informative time series. And here are the water use in millimeter for 4 sites. Cantaloupe, similar story. We're able to map that with the vegetation disease here shown in purple. In this case, it's a fall crop. So you're planting into shortening days. And that's why this red curve is showing the steep slope here. So every day gets a little shorter, a little bit less net radiation, a little bit less energy for evaporation. So the growth of the crop and the decrease in net radiation kind of offset each other, which results in this green curve, which is the crop coefficient, which stabilizes around 1 or just a little bit below 1. And here are the values for cantaloupe, quite variable in this case. Cotton. Cotton is one of the less typical crops for our study, long season. But we undertook this because we wanted to compare the cotton grown in central Arizona to the crops grown to cotton grown in Yuma area. And so my general understanding of that is that in Yuma, the cotton's planted early, taken out early, so shorter, faster season. Whereas in central Arizona, it's a long season crop right through the summer. And what we found is that the Yuma crop uses somewhat less water than Maricopa does. Spinach is a very challenging crop for us to study because the spatial extent of the crops are quite narrow, and the time window is very short. Here's some results from that. The green curve kind of, as you can see, kind of stops, but we're collecting the satellite data after that, which just says that the spinach matures. It gets full canopy density after we had to move our station out. Crop coefficient's around 1, 4 inches of water for spinach. Iceberg and romaine is a pending manuscript. We have visited 12 sites throughout the Yuma area. And I guess the main message for you here is that, again, it's planted in September, October, or later. Tremendous variability, day-to-day variability early in the season is shown by this lower left-hand side. You can see daily evapotranspiration from 2.5 millimeters up to around 8 millimeters. Very uncertain, a lot of it due to open soil evaporation. And then as we come to the shortest day of the year, that whole evapotranspiration signal compresses to around 2 millimeters per day. The eddy covariance on the upper left-hand side shows very strong correspondence to the irrigation events. You can see how the black curve peaks and then rapidly drops almost exponentially, and then the next irrigation. So you see 3 clear spikes of irrigation events that we pick up. Here's some more examples of irrigation events. Here you have 5 or 6 of them. We've been able to track those. Incidentally, we have a companion study going on using a model known as Bates, which is University of California, Riverside, where a postdoc scientist is using these same data in a soil water balance model and our data from eddy covariance to validate a simpler way to use satellite data to get daily evapotranspiration. We're looking at soil moisture in detail. You can see with the soil moisture sensors and eddy covariance how after each irrigation event that the water content drops exponentially and then spikes up. Here showed you in the purple. The right-hand side shows you a thermal map from the EcoStress. This was the sensor that's on the board of the space station. The red outline shows you the French Space Agency's Venus satellite footprint. So blue colors show you cooler areas, which is where there's a lot of evapotranspiration, and red colors or orange colors are where there's very little. Some emerging technologies with satellite that are not yet in practice are what we call red edge bands. So traditional remote sensing for agriculture has used just 2 bands to construct what we call normalized difference vegetation index, NDVI. It's essentially a ratio of near infrared to red radiation, and when plant cover is high, the NDVI is high. We did a panel of 12 different indices, as illustrated in this graph on the right-hand side, to show you the behavior of NDVI, which is the upper left-hand most plot, and we compared that with some other published and documented and researched indices. And I'll show you in the next slide that a couple of these red edge indices could be very useful for crop monitoring. One of the things that could be very useful for water balance modeling using satellite data is to know when your irrigation events are. One of the tools you could use would be active radar. Unfortunately, radar is not available frequently enough, but it would penetrate clouds and have no weather issues. But we do have satellites with sufficient resolution that can pick up the irrigation events. Illustrated here on the left-hand side shows you an NDVI signal, but in fact, there's an even stronger signal from what's called the chlorophyll index green. And every time there's an irrigation event in bare soil, you get a bright, strong spike in the time series. So this can be very useful because if you're monitoring the fields if you're monitoring a lot of fields, you can tell when to start your water balance model. And when there's an irrigation event, you know that the soil profile has been replenished. The other thing that's important to know with satellites is when the plants actually emerge. So there's a period of about 20 days, maybe 30 days, and you want to know when the plants are actually emerging. So we compared all of those 12 indices in that previous panel. We looked at that, and the normalized difference vegetation index is actually a quite mediocre index, and there's much better ways to detect emergence. And the two that I have found in the study, one's called the chlorophyll index red edge, which is a simple two-band index, and a more complicated index using 4 red edge bands. Shows down here, it shows you that detects the crop emergence of lettuce early, very early, within 5 days sooner than the normalized difference vegetation index. We also want to know how to get fractional cover, because the energy balance models and the water balance models depend on how much of the landscape is covered by vegetation versus how much is covered by soil. Again, normalized difference vegetation index has been used to do that, but the red edge indices show there might be a better way to do that. On the left-hand side, we've compared for romaine these different indices. So the time series on the upper left and the green curve shows you the progression of romaine. It's a very rapid growth. So the first 25 days, not much happens, and then it suddenly grows. All of these indices are pretty much nonlinear. But again, NDVI is kind of the mediocre index. It's easy to do, it's readily available, but it's not the best one. There are a couple others that are better. One is called the, I'll call it OSAVI, but essentially an optimized soil adjusted index. And it's here in the middle right-hand side. And then a second index is this red edge index. It's the lower left-hand side. It's fairly linear. So using the optimized index and comparing that with NDVI, we show a better correlation. For in this case, it's iceberg. We did the similar study for romaine. Very high R-squareds and a slope of about 1.28 times that index gives you fractional cover. So we validated this using drone data, which has centimeter level resolution. Often forgotten with the satellite data is you can detect water stress. My expertise is in thermal infrared, and we've always argued that thermal infrared is very important for detecting when crops aren't getting enough water because you can't detect it with vegetation disease. We found a couple of years ago that assumption was wrong. It doesn't mean you shouldn't use thermal infrared, but it says that the satellites using visible near infrared radiation are very good and can actually detect water stress events, and that's shown here in the circle here. In this particular field, the farmer shorted water at the worst possible time for his wheat crop, and I was tracking the vegetation indices and it dropped down. I thought I made a processing error. There was no error. It was actually, the crop was hurting, and we could see that from space. So just a point to remember that the satellite data has a powerful amount of information. Crop coefficients. So we've been tasked by the Bureau of Reclamation to update their crop coefficient methodology. It may not be that growers want to use crop coefficients, but crop coefficients can greatly simplify a complicated picture. In the case of reclamation, the use of crop coefficients allows them to study the entire lower Colorado River extent, all irrigated agriculture in a simplified way. Is it the most accurate? Probably not, but it's an operational feasible and quite good result. It's based on the Penman-Monteith equation, which many of you are familiar with. On the top of the slide shows you the AFC standardized ET. It looks complicated, but essentially it has two components. It has net radiation on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, it has weather data, which would be humidity, wind speed, and air temperature. So a weather station can readily compute what's called ETSC. So on the left-hand side is an eddy covariance I've showed you before. With cotton, you can see that it's quite complicated, lots of jumping around from day to day. And then the red curve is the standardized ET, which is that red value. With a crop coefficient, you can ratio the black to the red and get what we see here on the right-hand side. It would be this green curve, quite jumpy. And then if we have enough data, we can simplify that into a trapezoidal pattern. The purple is vegetation index-based estimation, which shows that the trapezoidal pattern crop coefficient mimics the vegetation index. This provides you a pathway to a simpler way to get daily ET. So for the Bureau, we've been updating the crop coefficients. Some have changed up, some have changed down. Many have changed duration. This is just an illustration of some of the crops we've looked at. So there are three main phases of crop coefficients. One we call initial, which is where the crop has just been planted and before it's emerged. And then mid-season, where the crop is at fully developed stage. And then KCN, which is the end of the season. Well, of course, with vegetable crops, their KCN doesn't exist because you've already cut it. So that third coefficient isn't so important. But with these three coefficients and duration values, you can generate trapezoidal patterns as illustrated at the bottom for watermelon. And you can see that the patterns have changed. The standardized patterns for red have been updated with our data in blue. And you can see on the right-hand side, the ET that we're estimating for these different crops. We're just now synthesizing many other crops. A couple of them that are really important, of course, are alfalfa. The satellite data with the crop coefficients can show you that alfalfa duration between cuttings decreases from this is a complicated graph here, but this is a synthesis of hundreds of fields seen by satellite and shows that the duration of the cutting for alfalfa decreases throughout the year and then increases back in December. On the bottom left shows you that the standardized model for reclamation overestimates the number of cuttings that typical growers in Yuma Valley does. We wouldn't know that without the satellite data. This has a major impact on the total water used. Right-hand side shows you some other crops and their crop coefficients. So the crop coefficients that are used by reclamation are green and our updates are in the dashed black. So in some cases like broccoli, the standardized model is really wrong. So it's been important for us to study that. And the lower right-hand shows the impact of using the updated coefficients changes the trajectory of crop water use for cotton. Lastly, for cotton, we're often questioned, well, okay, so single crop coefficients are not preferred by the science community. They like what are called dual crop coefficients. They have a basal crop coefficient, which is for vegetation, and then a KE, which would be your edaphic coefficient for bare soil conditions. And they prefer that. Well, reclamation doesn't want that complication, at least at this stage. And the question is, how accurate is that? Well, here's an example of for cotton, our 7 studies. Now, it's admittedly not perfect, but here we have an R-squared of about 0.7 and the regression relationship between model ET and observed ET. And we have less than 10% error for total evapotranspiration. I'd say that's remarkably good. Lastly, so some of the results we've had from our data, I list them here. These are all preliminary, but just to give you a feel the kind of variability, the numbers we have versus what have been in the literature for decades. So on the right-hand side, what I call ET Erie is the Leonard Erie data that you have probably seen in inches. And then in the middle column is what we're measured with the eddy covariance. You can see that some of them are not that far apart, some of them are higher, some of them are lower. We'll update all of these. What's next? So we're 6 years into this project, I think, 5, 6 years, and we're going to report out on all the crops, all the important crops we've done. We'll document those. We'll complete the water use measurement for most of them. We might have a few ancillary crops we'll add. The next talk after next, we'll discuss the prototype app that we have. We're going to incorporate remote sensing data in TT. It's not just for science research. This could be a practical tool for growers and water managers, but it will require integration of satellites of all kinds. It'll also use aircraft data where practical, and drones for subfield calibration. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Do you guys have any questions for Andy?
I got one.
Bobby.
Yes, sir. Back to your graph of your measurements versus Leonard Erie. I grew up in the Leonard Erie era and used systems of use numbers for calculating irrigation needs. There's a big difference in alfalfa. Does that have to do with varieties from now as opposed to in the Leonard's time?
Yeah, I couldn't hear all of it, but
Andy.
I should emphasize that the alfalfa results are right now they're based primarily. Well, there's two parts of the story. One part is that we only have results for one station, one site, Yuma Mesa, and we weren't able to collect the full year. So there is some uncertainty on that number. And the second part of the story is that we're estimating the number of cuttings from remote sensing data, which is, I think, different from what the Erie study did. And then reclamation has yet another estimation number of cuttings. They say 10 cuttings. Well, that's not the norm that we've seen in the last 3 years in Yuma. Now, it could change. So that number of cuttings is going to have a huge impact on those water use numbers. So that I'm just posting that to give you a gauge of what we're seeing now, but they could change.
Okay.
I was going to ask you, Andy, to comment something very similar. Is just which crops you've seen the biggest changes, more or less, and do you know why? Very similar question.
Yeah.
I might put this on Sanchez's lap, but I think spinach is one of the bigger changes. Lettuce hasn't changed an awful lot. I mean, I think Leonard Erie numbers were quite good. Cotton, there's been some big changes there. Wheat is changing in a big way too, because of course, I don't think the Erie paper was really considering wheat grown in Yuma, and the way you grow it there in Yuma is so different. And then when it's ready to be done, it's done super fast. So there's not a long tail. So those are some crops, I think, some of the biggest changes.
Related to that question of that, what do you attribute the changes to? Is it just have more data, better constrained models, or there's some because the cropping patterns are different?
So I'll repeat it if I can. He was just asking what you attribute the changes to, whether it's better measurements, different varieties. You've mentioned some of them already, but what do you attribute the changes to?
Well, I think the first thing is the measurements. I mean, my hat's off to Leonard Erie, but to plug soil samples and bring them to the lab and dry them out, it's a ton of work and it's not spatially representative. With eddy covariance, you have a footprint that's much more extensive, so it has a better averaging. So I'd say the technique is what's changed things, but that doesn't, I shouldn't ignore the fact that Varieties have changed a lot. And then the other thing, again, I'll put this on Sanchez's lap, but because I wasn't around, but the water management practices in Yuma have changed a lot. The way you apply the water, shorter runs, faster runs, have changed the water use patterns and become very efficient. So those are some factors that cause the numbers to change.
I might mention that report that I showed first from 2015 showed that over the last 40 years, I think that Yuma is using about 18% less water than they were before, and in many cases producing more.
And part of it too is the difference, they've changed their rotation pattern. Used to be that wheat was being planted at the end of November, 1st of December. Now it's planted in January, having to do with new water years. As the guys farm, if they start running out of their water and there's no excess water anymore in the system. So you've got, I think that changes it as well.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask Andy one more thing, because he showed a lot of excitement at one of our presentations about satellite technology. And I wonder, Andy, could you just speak to how satellite technology has come along in the last 5 years and what you think, where you think it's going, especially, and how it might be used by producers in the future?
Okay, the first thing that's happened is that the number of overpasses is the frequency of satellite overpasses is just shrunk. But previously we would have satellite overpasses every 16 days at 100-foot resolution. And now we're getting satellite overpasses, I'm talking about free data. We're getting free data and Yuma, well, Yuma's lucky because of location and clear skies. We're getting data every 3 to 5 days at 10 meters, so 30-foot resolution instead of 100-foot. And we're getting them in 12 bands. So, I mean, it's just explosive improvement in satellite quality. I mean, before it was, if you look at some of the old papers like AgriStars that USDA used to put out, talk about how we could use satellites, remote sensing to improve irrigation. Well, it didn't work. It doesn't work because all it takes is one cloudy day, and then you're a month down the line. You can't operate a farm with one observation a month. But now the satellite data is coming down. Actually, commercially, it's coming down every day. Planet Corporation. Now, those aren't free, but those data are frequent. So that's the biggest change that's happened, is that the population of satellites is just, I don't know, exponential, but it's huge. And then the quality of the data, the validation of the data. So there's been a tremendous amount of work on calibrating the reflectance that's measured. So you could put a camera on a satellite, okay, take a picture. If that's all you wanted, that's okay, but we're actually using these quantitatively. So the vegetation index, you don't just say on off binary, you'd actually calibrate that to fraction of cover by crop type. Or you can actually detect chlorophyll content. And then the emerging techniques are what they call induced fluorescence, which can detect plant stress based on the photosynthetic reaction. And then I mentioned peripherally about radar. So next year, there'll be a joint US-Indian satellite called NISAR. And there's already some radar satellites up there now, Sentinel-5, I believe. And then Canada has radars that can measure the roughness of the earth, which in turn can indicate where the irrigation events are. The thing is, by themselves, maybe not so useful. The revolution is the integration of all these sensors together. Of course, it's a big task. No one person is going to be able to do that.
All right, thanks, Andy. Let's give him a hand.
Yes.
Next, we're going to have Dr. Charlie Sanchez, who's with U of A in the Environmental Science Department. He's a research professor and extension specialist, and he was in Yuma for a lot of years, still is here a lot, and he's one of the best experts I know as far as all of our agronomic practices, irrigation, soil, fertilization, all those things. So Charlie, I'll bring up your
Just to
slides.
follow up a couple of details in Andy's talk, you saw on his table he had two values for melons. One's with plastic mulch and one's without plastic mulch. With plastic mulch, you're going to use less than 10 inches to make a cantaloupe crop. Without plastic mulch, you're going to use about 19 inches. So that's an important thing. A couple of subtleties with lettuce. You plant lettuce September 17th, you're going to use 10 inches of water. You plant lettuce December 15th, you're going to use 12 inches. And that's related to the length of the growing period. Now, most of you know from your Plant Science 100, transpiration is tied to dry matter production or carbon fixation, and that's true. But the lengthening of the growing season creates a longer opportunity for evaporation losses. And that's a component of the ET quotient. We're going to get started on salts, that's the other end of this equation. And I'd like to rephrase this. And when you get too efficient, salinity becomes the limit to further improvements in efficiency. And that's the context. Okay, you can do that, okay. Little bit of our cropping system. Andy noted this. Bobby mentioned that she was part of it. You can see the system. We start out with some produce, typically sprinklers because of climate modification. We pick up some efficiencies there. We move through the produce crop. Then we go into a rotational crop. Then come in the summer, we start with a flat water. And this is our typical system. The question I'm going to address over the next 25 minutes is the salt tracking over this system. Go ahead. Okay, Andy talked about ET, but there's other non-consumptive beneficial uses of water. Climate modification is one. When it's going to freeze, we may flood our citrus orchard. That gives us some frost protection. Part of our conversion to sprinklers in September was to beat thermal dormancy, lower the temperature of the atmosphere, but we picked up efficiencies in the process. You might have let your land dry out too much, so you have to irrigate before you can work it. But the one I'm going to address is salt management, salt balance, and we're going to move on from there. Salts, what are the effects? The main effects we're concerned about here in Yuma are the osmotic effects. Plants have to expend extra energy to draw water against this osmotic gradient, and that's energy they have to divert from growth processes. There's other things, specific toxicities. I want to talk about sodium at the end, more in the context of other areas of Arizona. Go ahead. These are the ions we're talking about. Calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, chloride, nitrate, sulfate, bicarbonate. This is what we typically find in Colorado River water. I've been testing Colorado River water around for 3 decades. This is typically what we find. It doesn't change much because it's impounded behind Glen Canyon and impounded behind Hoover, and it mixes. All the various tributaries mix, and it doesn't change much. This is the ranges we can find in soil water. And this will range depending on management and soil texture and other things such as that. Next slide. Leaching requirement. We're going to define steady-state leaching here. Now, I have used transient models. Transient models are more complex. They take into account cation exchange and precipitation dissolution. And I've used transient models. But here's the reality. In application, we don't have enough data to use transient models across the full range of soils we encounter. We don't have the Pone exchange coefficients. We don't know all the dissociation constants. So at the end of the day, we're kind of stuck, hit the interaction with the steady state mass balance salt leaching requirement. And it works fairly well. Next. One thing we got to consider, though, is carbonates. Carbonates complicate our system a bit. And we have plants respiring, putting CO2 into the soil solution. And it always drives this carbonic acid chemistry. And this can precipitate some of the salts. And this is going to have an important point because sometimes EC is not really a good measurement of our leaching fraction. We have to use one of the more conservative components of the salt fraction, and that would be chloride. But the other thing this does is this can precipitate sodium, or it can precipitate calcium, I'm sorry, increasing the relative portion of sodium to calcium, and you can have sodium problems. But carbonate chemistry has a profound impact in our system. The pH of a solution in equilibrium with calcium carbonate is 8.2. We're never quite 8.2 because we have a microbial activity and this carbonic acid chemistry keeps our pH quite a bit lower than that, 7.8, 7.5. Next. Okay, this just shows you, I run speciation programs. Because of this carbonate, we exceed the KSB of a number of mineral species. So we have precipitation going on in our system, but we also can have dissolution under certain conditions. These are too soluble, gypsum and potassium chloride, to precipitate on our system, but many of these other minerals precipitate out. So that's the important thing of carbonate chemistry. We got to monitor this because some of the salt mitigation is taking place through this mechanism, precipitation. Probably over the long run, it's not that important. Over short intervals, it can be. Next. What do I have there? Let's talk about efficiency. It depends who's defining efficiency. The simplest way is irrigation efficiency, just ETC that Andy talked about, divided by water applied. Some people go ahead and rope in some of the other beneficial uses relative to water applied. On any given irrigation event, this becomes equivalent to IE, and then it's required depth for that irrigation event relative to water applied. Now, this is totally different. This is a totally different approach. This looks at yield relative to water applied. Next slide. And as Andy said, we've measured efficiency, and we're typically getting values greater than 85%. Now, you may say, well, that's not 90, that's not 100. Well, here's the deal. A leaching fraction of 15% is inadequate for salt balance. We're going to get salt accumulation if we have leaching fractions less than 20% of Colorado River water. Now, I have a value here of 60 to 100. What's 60? Spinach only needs 4.5 inches of water. So you run your sprinklers for 5 hours, and then a cloudburst comes and it dumps another inch on you. There's no way you're going to get a high efficiency there, but that's beyond your control. So these values typically come from spinach. You know, you take a crop like cauliflower that uses 18 inches, you get an inch of water. Well, it doesn't matter. When you get an inch on a crop that uses less than 5 inches, it can really throw off an efficiency value. Next slide. Here's a salt. This was just simply for stand establishment. And the question is, what happens during the sprinkler bed? And this is just stand establishment. We turn on the sprinklers, run it a couple of days, then we wet it at the hottest part of the day every day. And you can see salt accumulation. This is just a stand establishment practice. This is a site in Bard. We'll cut to the chase here and look at a lot of sites. Go ahead, I'm sorry. You can see salt's increased in every case, before or after, before or after. So typically, even our salt accumulation starts right off at crop establishment. You know, you see these sprinklers run for 2 days, and you think, oh man, that's a lot of water. But it's barely enough to fill the profile. Those sprinklers put out about 1/10 of an inch an hour. So over, 2 days, that you've barely refilled your profile. Next slide. Now the situation's a little different, and the late winter plantings, it takes us like a month to get a stand, and those sprinklers stay in the field a month, and we're wetting a little every day. Here we might get a little bit. This winter stand establishment event is probably not net salt loading. Next slide. Here's the seasonal changes. This is salinity mapped across the field using our EM38 methodology, and the salts go up over the whole season. This is lettuce. But let's show this data another way. Oh, this is wheat. Wheat. We thought we were picking up our leaching fraction in our rotational crop. That is seldom the case, as I'll show you here. So you can see this is before wheat, this is after wheat. We had salt accumulation across the entire field. Next slide. They mentioned summer fallow. You go out in the Los Angeles Metropolitan Water District or whoever pays you not to grow a crop that summer, and you move on. But we had an eddy covariance system. We've had a couple in fallow fields, and the field dries out from your last irrigation pretty quick. Then it reaches an equilibrium with a water table. You're still getting about 2 millimeters evaporation. I say ET, but there's no transpiration here. There's just evaporation a day. Where's this water coming from? It's coming from the shallow ground water table. Next slide. And salts are increasing in each case. You cannot come out of a summer fallow period without doing a leaching, flat water leaching, and it may even be greater than that required in a cropping system. Next slide. Here is this is a field in the barred area. This is before summer fallow. This is after. And this is one leaching requirement, and we still haven't fully reclaimed this piece of land. Next. Now, let's look at our crop. Let's look at the main vegetable cropping season. Here's the total sites. Andy talked about some of these. We added equivariant systems in them. I tracked the salts. This is sites with salt loading in the season. The majority of them in every case, and this is percent salt increase over these systems. Across the board, we've increased salts. Let's say we're not going to trust our ECE values. Let's look at chloride across the board. Chloride, because it's a conservative anion, is probably a better reflection of leaching than simple ECE of the saturated paste extract. Okay? Next. How about the rotational crops? There we go after we take out the fall, winter, spring produce. In most cases, again, net leaching, net salt accumulation. When I went into this project 5-6 years ago, I assumed we were getting much of our required leaching in the rotational crop. This clearly shows we're not. Sometimes in Sudan grass we are, but sometimes we are not. It's the only one that ever shows any indication of being a net leaching system. Next. And it gets compounded. This is lettuce wheat rotation. This is before pre-irrigation. We cleaned up our soil some for pre-irrigation. This is, you can see. Then you can see after lettuce. Then you can see after wheat. And it goes through more depths than just the surface. You can see accumulation with the lettuce. You can see accumulation with the wheat. So this challenge gets compounded because we're irrigating incredibly efficiently. Next slide. This is lettuce watermelons. We increased it with lettuce, and we increased it again with watermelons. So the point I want to make here is that flat water we do in the summer is of paramount importance to our sustainability. There's just no way to argue against that. This is so one-sided, it's almost embarrassing. Next slide. Now, I want to talk about sodium. Sodium does things over and above the osmotic effect of salt. Sodium destroys soil structure. And this is the typical fashion in which we assess sodium impacts, adverse impacts of sodium. Sodium destroys soil structure, infiltration is impeded, you have a mess. Next slide. And because of the bicarbonate chemistry, we have to use an indice that takes that into account. And in this case, it's the adjusted SAR. Sometimes we use what we call the cross ratio. What the cross does is it recognizes the reality that magnesium is not as good a flocculator as calcium, and potassium, all not as potent deflocculator as sodium, is a potent nevertheless, a deflocculator nevertheless. So it kind of weights potassium and magnesium into an adjusted SAR ratio. Next. Colorado River water, we're good. We're well below any impacts of salinity. The sodium absorption ratio in the cross of the Colorado River is good. But we're right on the line. As we go into drought, there's talks about augmenting the surface water deliveries with groundwater. As we go into drought, the signature of municipal waste discharge into the river will increase. We're right on the line, so we have to keep track of this. We have no sodium problem today, but as the fingerprint of snowmelt decreases in the main channel of the river, we could. Next slide. Now, in central Arizona, we're already there. As part of drought, tier 1 drought, they've cut off a lot of their surface water deliveries. I've looked at some wells in some districts. A whole bunch of that groundwater is problematic. So if you're a producer in central Arizona, you're going to have to remain cognizant of this. You're going to have to essentially treat this water, or you're going to ruin your land in a relatively short period of time. Next slide. Now, there's one last point I want to make on beneficial use. This is some models I published probably 20 years ago. And the point I want to make is the way we farm, short irrigation runs, relatively high flow rates, trapezoidal furrows. The bowl is great. I love it. It really reduces friction. Our efficiencies are quite high. And because the intake rate of most of our soils, our median soil is low, it's a silty clay loam or a loam, our distribution uniformities are always high. So we can complete advance in 80 to 90 minutes, and our distribution uniformities are well over 90%. But when we go to sprinklers, next slide. This is some data I've measured on sprinklers. Here's the problem. I've also modeled the hydraulic networks of sprinklers. They're a very well-engineered system. But once you disperse that droplet into the atmosphere, all things can change on you. And because we can't control wind, and we can't control when the crop needs water relative to wind, we really can't expect our distribution uniformities over the long haul. We can get distribution uniformities close to 100% when it's calm, but it's not calm all the time. On average, you can see we're skewed towards 80%. And the point I want to make is even because you have a technology where you can irrigate for ET replacement doesn't mean you should. Because a field like this, you're going to have vast portions of a field that you're going to under-irrigate, and you're going to have portions you're going to over-irrigate. Final slide. So to summarize, the salinity story is irrigation efficiency for all crop systems are high, more than 85%. That does not even meet our required leaching of 23% for sustainability. Next slide. Pre-irrigation is paramount importance to our sustainability. There's just no question about that. Next slide. Sodium is not an issue with Colorado river water today. It is an issue in parts of Arizona as their surface water deliveries have been curtailed or halted altogether, and they're having to use more groundwater. For sprinkler irrigated crops, distribution uniformity is another consideration. You really should be routinely irrigating these crops for 120% ET replacement, or there's going to be parts of that field that are under irrigated. And I'll introduce the last talk, which is essentially we're developing some tools to help track this salt balance. What this tool will enable you to know is you're coming out of your season and it's summer, what kind of leaching requirement you need in that flat water irrigation. So that's all I'll have to say today. If there's any questions, I'll answer them. Yes, Bobby.
Oh, it's not a question, it's just I love it. That's what I've thought all of my career, and it just is driving me crazy.
That we spent a couple of $1 million to find out what you knew all along. That is a drag. We have no pre-irrigation that uses an acre foot of water. It's more like 4 inches. A, and B, he's impaired the long-term sustainability of that land. You know, I think that's one of the objectives of the Yuma Agriculture Water Coalition is to generate the data to push back on that nonsense. So hopefully this data will do that. But, you know, I know your point. I get calls from hedge fund people in New York and these places all the time. They're looking at water as like gold. They're looking at it as a medium of economic exchange. I have 3 minutes, and I can answer another question before. Yes, sir.
What I recall last year was the first year, but they curtailed water rates.
It kicked in this year, tier 1.
How much of that was due to
There was nothing due to salinity. It was due to having a lower priority water right, and those guys have to be cut.
Because of the levels of Lake Mead
Mm-hmm.
is what triggered it.
No, the salinity problem for them is yet to come.
Yeah, I purposely use the term too efficient. People don't like that term, and it's a new thing, but it's something we need to drive out there is you don't want to get too efficient. They'll talk about, well, you need to use drip. And I don't know if, Charlie, you want to comment on drip, but I mean, it's just the same point. If you're too efficient, you're not leaching the salt, and you're not sustainable.
Diminishing returns.
Yes, sir.
There was a couple other questions.
Yes, sir.
Briefly, do you foresee DTC numbers going up in the next 10 years? Or believe in global warming or not?
Actually, they for a crop, they might go down in the short run because you're decreasing the growing interval. In all our data sets, we see that. That stuff we plant in September, lettuce we plant in September uses less water than lettuce we plant in December. Celery we plant in September uses less water than celery we plant in October. And And like I said, that's due to more opportunity for evaporation losses over longer time intervals in the field.
Days are getting shorter. But if the average global temperature is going up, it is or not?
The crop adaptation will fall apart long before that.
Okay.
So Toby Torrey is I don't know your exact title, Toby, but he's a software developer on what's called the Cyber Communications team at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And they're working with us to develop this mobile app based on the research that we've been performing, the new data that we've gotten. And I think with that, I'll let him take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name is Toby. I'm feeling a little under the weather, so please forgive any coughs or sniffles. I'm the director of the Web and Mobile Development Unit for CCT, Communications and Cyber Technologies. I apologize up front. I am a computer nerd and am not an agricultural expert, but I hope I know enough to communicate needs and solutions by now. A little bit about our team. We're a group of interface designers and programmers at the U of A in the Division of Agriculture, Life and Veterinary Sciences and Cooperative Extension. We build web applications that behave and perform like native applications on your iPhone or on your Android. But these web applications work well on all devices from phones and tablets to laptops and desktops. We consider interactive mapping and mathematical modeling and the use of remote sensing data to be within our wheelhouse. So it felt like a natural fit when Paul brought this project to our team. And it's been a pleasure working on this app with everybody who's been involved. We like to say that our design process is user-centric, meaning we try to research and discover what the user actually needs and to try to build an interface that delivers exactly that. In some cases, this might mean we're building an application for what we call the power user with hundreds of knobs and dials and tools that require the first-time user go through a steep learning curve. But in most cases, our team is contracted to develop an intuitive interface that works well for the first-time user and focuses on the features that all the users need. My personal philosophy is to start sparse with the utility we know everybody needs, and then to build upon that as we discover new needs, whether they're niche or broad. So today I'm here to talk a little bit about the current state of the application, the web app. Ultimately, this web app that we're building is intended to deliver these insights into water use and salinity management generated by the science that Andy and Charlie discussed in their presentations. We've spent a great deal of time researching and designing the application on paper and converting the models behind the scenes provided by Andy, Charlie, and other collaborators into a web-based API. And right now we are actively testing and constructing the front end, making good progress. The front end is the application you see and how it behaves as you click around on the various tools and such. We're also wrapping up the development on the back end, kind of the fundamental development on the back end. And the back end is what does all the calculations to deliver these recommendations and insights. Our current goal right now is to make sure everything is working as designed and working as expected. Then once we reach that milestone, we are planning on partnering with a handful of experienced growers to help us evaluate the numbers, the recommendations coming out of the system, and to give us some feedback on the overall utility of the application for their needs. So today I thought the best way to discuss where we are and where we're headed is to walk through a few screens from the latest development version of the application. I apologize if we encounter any unfinished drywall or exposed wiring along the way. We're making changes every day to this exact platform, and it's often one step back in order to make two steps forward. I think that walking through this application, like I said, will be the best way to discuss where we're headed and what's done. I'm hoping to also provoke some questions, comments, ideas, concerns of yours. So please make note of any feedback you have for any Q&A time we have after the show and tell. And I'll reiterate that I don't know a ton about agriculture, and we do these things in testing where we repeatedly go through some of the same motions to test the system. So please don't get upset with me if I do things that make no sense, like planting cotton in November. So diving right in, here it is. We're calling it DesertAgWISE at the moment. This is the homepage. There'll be some marketing materials to attract first-time users, but there'll also be some resources available to find out what the app is, how it works, how to use it. We'll make it all available very easily. But to see how it works and what it does, you're going to have to log in, create an account and log in. One of the improvements we have slated is the ability to create an account and to log in using just your phone number. If it's inconvenient for everybody in your organization that wants to use this tool to have a unique email address, we want to support a phone number as well. So right away, you see the fundamental kind of organization. We're going to, in this demo, we're going to create a farm. And on this farm, we're going to add a field or two. And to those fields, we're going to add crops. So when you add a farm, it's really just a name and a description. New farm for demo. Hi, everybody. And really, it's an organizational tool. We imagine a lot of users that use this tool will use this tool for just one farm and manage several fields on that farm. But we also imagine consultants who have several clients might want to keep their separate farms separate here. Ultimately, a farm is just a collection of fields in a named folder of sorts. So I wouldn't be surprised if users discover a way to leverage this beyond what was intended. So now that the farm is created, I can add a field to said farm. Here's the list of fields for that farm. Currently have none. I'll add a field to it. And the first thing we ask you to do is to draw your farm, draw the field, draw the boundaries of your field using most likely the polyline tool. Once that is drawn, what we're doing here is we're automatically fetching, we're calculating acreage, which is pretty simple to do. But we're also fetching some soil data from NRCS surveys and kind of synthesizing that information to determine the soil types at different depths. Like Andy mentioned, we need to know what's happening at the tippy top of the soil, but also in the deeper regions. And so we kind of auto detect that because we don't expect most of our users to know that upfront about their field. So after determining that, you would name the farm or the field. You can update the acreage if you have a more precise number that you think would be better for water calculations later. And you can override the soil type. We're working to improve this. If you know everything about your soil, maybe there's a more involved way to tell us what your soil's like. Then we ask you to select the nearest ASMET station. The application does all of its calculations using weather data collected at these ASMET stations. So it'll zoom in on your nearest one. You can click on it to read what the station does or what it's named, any properties about it. Select the station. And here's some information we need to capture up front. Your opportunity to tell us, hey, I'm using something other than Colorado River water. And if so, tell us a little bit about the salinity of that water. And also, if you're using this, we are going to make some assumptions about the initial soil salinity. But if you happen to know that you're starting using this tool on a field where you know the soil salinity in decisiemens per meters, you can override this. And ultimately, now that you've created a field and you've added it to the farm, we can add the first crop to this field. So I'm going to, like I said, do something weird and add cotton in November.
Toby,
Yeah.
a quick comment. The reason it didn't auto-populate the closest ASMET station is that maybe over a hill or something where there's a different station that's better, or maybe even in the future, we may be able to incorporate other things besides ASMET if there's other weather sources. So that's
Absolutely.
the reason that we pick, because we didn't want it to just auto-populate something that maybe isn't going to give you the best, most local weather data.
I agree. So yeah, we included elevation as one of the properties you might want to know most about. Okay. So you can tell us if you irrigated up, what the wet date was. Let's say it was, I don't know, the next day. Projected harvest date, we're not doing much with this right now in the application, but we can provide alerts if you're approaching your harvest date for a particular field, and your default irrigation system. So every time you add irrigation information to the application, it's going to assume you use this default, but you'll be able to use different ones, as you'll see. Save the field, and you now have the field. Let's go take a look at this field. And I'm getting an error. Hold on a second. Okay. So this is, let me make sure I captured everything I wanted to capture. Yep. So what we're looking at here is the summary dashboard for an individual field. We imagine this being the main information tab to deliver those insights, recommendations. We think that getting an understanding of what the leaching shortage you've accrued might be, and what projected irrigations, where we can tell you you haven't watered since November, so you need to add 9.2 inches right away, is kind of what we're saying here. We're working on the most intuitive way to present this information, and so when we're ready to work with you to evaluate this, we're hoping for good feedback here. Aside from how to use this mid-season, Charlie touched on the idea of using some of this information in between growing seasons to manage the salinity and maybe help you make some pre-irrigation decisions. What we then get into after this is the history tab. This is kind of the calendar view of all the irrigations that you've told us about. You can now go back and add irrigations. Let's say you know that you added some irrigation to December 14th. You can go to add irrigation event, go to December 14th here, and say we ran the sprinkler, we applied 1/2 inch. We want to develop a conversion calculator here, and our prototype is working for cubic feet per second, and you tell us how long you left it running for, and we convert that to inches based on your acreage. And again, you can say in this particular watering, we're using something other than our default watering source. And you can just add some notes if you wanted to keep track of this irrigation being a kind of outlier irrigation event. And as you add those, our recommendations will likely change. Since that was so long ago, it's still saying Thursday today for 9.2 inches. The other thing that the calendar, or I think you can switch to like a list view here for a history of everything. The other thing that this interface is for confirming, overriding, or adding rain events that weren't captured by ASMET. So automatically we'll place rain events that were detected by ASMET onto the calendar for you. It happened to have rained yesterday, apparently, for 0.02 inches on your field. We leave it unconfirmed until you've come and confirmed it. You have the opportunity to override it, explain some notes if it was a strange event for just you, but not this other field. And this way, all the irrigations and the rain inform the water use calculations on the summary tab. The other things we're planning for the future, right now we want the ability to manage future crops kind of planned for a particular field. We've been talking about a possible cyclical or seasonal template that the user can set up that says, hey, for this field, every year it's going to look like this, where I plant this crop on this date and then or around this date, and we plant this other crop on this date. But that also touches on opportunities, I guess I could call it, for managing fields that change shape in a predictable or seasonal pattern, where maybe every year this portion of the field is set aside for broccoli or whatnot. And maybe the best way to handle that that we're investigating is the ability to split your fields into multiple fields and merge them back on a seasonal kind of a pattern that you define. Again, that's diving into that complexity, which is I believe, might be beyond the core functionality everybody needs. So it's something we're exploring right now. Some planned improvements that we are already implementing, or other ones we're still exploring. Support for different crops. We started with cotton, then we started with cotton from Maricopa because we had the good math on that we trusted. Then we expanded the model to handle cotton grown anywhere using a heat unit model instead of a time-based model, and leverage that to build a wheat model. We're currently working on a lettuce model, iceberg lettuce, I believe. And so more crops will follow after that once we determine what would be the most beneficial for everybody. We're also looking to manage. We understand that users will likely need the ability to manage a large number of crops or fields or farms. Everything I've shown in this presentation is kind of a small scale operation where you have a handful of fields that you would manage manually like this, that one person might manage manually like this. So we've been investigating ways to create a large number of fields, whether that's by importing a spreadsheet or a shapefile with all of your fields, locations, and geometries. And again, maybe that ability to split and merge fields will facilitate that. And on top of that, once you've loaded all your fields, we need a way for you to report all your irrigations. If you have that many fields, we might need a more efficient way to input your irrigations or to confirm rain events and such. So we're designing a top-level report that kind of predicts which pending notifications need your attention first. In addition to that, we anticipate many people will want to collaborate with other users on a particular farm or a particular field or a collection of fields or the entire field or entire farm. Whether these other users are colleagues in your same organization, or if they're consultants you're working with or researchers you're helping out. So we're working on balancing that interface for deciding who gets access to what for your field. What am I sharing? What do they get to change? What do they not get to change? As you can imagine, balancing that complexity or the granularity of those knobs and dials can take a long time because we want to make sure you get to do what you need them to do, but it doesn't take all day to manage them. We also expect that users will want to export any of this data that they're collecting here. If this is their one place they're collecting all this information, it would definitely come in handy to export this for charting or import into other systems your organization might depend upon. That's something we've already started implementing and should be simple to do. But again, we'll need feedback on whether it's working well for our users. A couple of the big things we're exploring kind of long-term, we'd love to, Paul kind of touched on the idea that we want to expand this to allow access to weather data from more than just ASMET, possibly. Maybe you pay for one of these private data streams that Andy mentioned from a private organization, and you'd like to adapt this tool to use that weather data instead of an ASMET station uphill from, a mile away. And so how would we facilitate that while guaranteeing your privacy and not breaching any agreements you may have made with that private organization? And again, the next big thing that we want to do is incorporating satellite data in innovative ways, like the red edge bands Andy mentioned in his presentation, ultimately to inform the user about the expected growth or the expected growth stages or events like emergence compared to what is actually detected on the ground via satellite, maybe to detect water stress and to adjust the feedback like these irrigation recommendations accordingly. That's a big thing we know we intend to do. We're just exploring how to present that best. And lastly, another aspect, another function we're committed to developing is an open web API so that anybody else who wants to build applications or do simple calculations and want to use the models and calculations that we're using to provide these irrigation recommendations or these salinity insights, we want to open those up and document them so they're clear on how you can interact with them through a web API. Ran through a lot there of where we're at, what we want to do, where we're headed. But ultimately, we're about to make that bend. We're about to turn the corner where the developers and the interface people have found all the pitfalls and patches and exposed wiring, like I mentioned earlier, and we've smoothed it all out, and we're finally ready to have an open house and let some of the early adopters walk through, use the application, and give us some feedback on more about how the app, the numbers that are coming out of it, the recommendations that are coming out of it, and the intuitiveness along with the utility, how useful it is for you and your organization. That's the feedback we want to capture. We think if we open that up now, you might run into some of these pitfalls or these unfinished drywall rooms, and the feedback won't be as valuable at this point in time. So we're approaching that milestone, and I hope to reach that in the coming weeks and months so that we can capture some people mid-growing season with wheat or towards the beginning of growing seasons with cotton and such. That's what I have for you today. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, ideas, I can't speak too well on the agronomy or all of the math, but I can field questions about the app's interface, design, or its functionality. Andy and Charlie would be happy to answer any questions regarding the science or the agriculture related to how we present it and how we capture the inputs from the user. And I'm going to put up a URL on the screen right now as well. If you'd like to sign up for future release announcements or to get in line to be one of these early adopter beta testers to help us evaluate this tool, we'll ask that you just send us some contact information. We'll add you to a list, and we'll contact this list as we approach these milestones. I believe we're going to hand out a paper version as well.
Yeah, Toby, I'll pass that around. Is anything you want to comment on that, or just what you just said? But I'm gonna pass
Nope. Here's the URL. It should take you to a very simple survey. Name, email, company name. I believe it's all optional except the email. Let us know if you want to be on the ground floor with kind of providing the feedback that this portion of the app is very confusing, or this portion is providing valuable insight, and I need this portion of the app to be quicker to get to and such like that. So any questions other than that?
Bobby.
I'm confused. Is the purpose of this app is to where you record all your irrigations? What do you do? I mean, is it for water management, water scheduling, consumptive water use? What is my end result that I'm looking for, or that this app is going to do for me?
Did you hear that, Toby?
Yeah. So yes, functionally, we are asking you to input your irrigations into the system. Tell us how much you're irrigating and when, and we let you know, and we run those numbers through the model, and we get an output of the current state of the depletion, the soil depletion, and we make recommendations. Right now we're saying, hey, you need to water this many inches a week from today. And that's kind of our interpretation of the mathematics saying you are currently at the soil depletion level. And based on historical data, we're expecting ET to look like this for the following week or so.
Bobby, I think I can answer what you're after. What this model does is it will project your irrigation and how much you should apply. And it does that this way. It uses measured data up to that day. From that day to the future, it uses historical data. But continuously, it adjusts it for measured data.
Okay.
So the projection is based on a combination of data measured to that time you're projecting and long-term averages going into the future. But it's updated continuously.
Correct, but okay, if you go back to the very starting date, do you measure your soil moisture before you put your crop in, before your first irrigation, so you know where you're starting?
We're kind of getting some rough approximations. If someone doesn't have that data, we have some defaults that we think will work for them.
Okay.
Even salinity, someone may not know their salinity at time 1. Their default is 2.5 Colorado River water. And you would agree that's a good value.
Okay, so when I taught water management, was only 50% of the water in the soil was available. Is that calculated?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Oh, those constants are all in there.
okay.
Thanks, Charlie. Yes.
Not only that, it takes into account what each crop's manageable allowable depletion is.
Great.
For lettuce, only half of it is available, and you can only take down to 40% of that.
Exactly.
All that's in there.
All right.
I am very excited to explore the user base. And if we hear from everybody that they understand a lot about their field before day 1 and want to input that into the calculations, we can adapt. But I think we're developing this application for a broad group of people who, a majority of which we're expecting they don't know a ton about what's going on in their soil before day 1. And a lot of our calculations start doing the math the second you wet your field. So if you're planting wet or irrigating up, it all starts the second you've applied your first irrigation, so to speak. Anybody else?
We do.
If I could say this straight, but so I work with organic and regenerative farming practices, and if a farmer was planting wheat and they set the no-till system and they left the residue on the field and they dramatically impacted their transpiration because of the mulch layer, just not speak nothing of the soil biology that's going on there. Is there any capacity to, I'm assuming that the algorithms are primarily driving those components. In other words, that would be a hard variable to add into this system. Is that true? And what's the capacity for kind of the future use of alternative practices?
We would have to get EPC data from a mulch system like that. Cantaloupes, we know there's 2 values, one for plastic mulch and one for not. If you're no-till and you have a lot of residue on the surface, we don't know what that is because we have no native cooperative systems in those fields. We just have them in everything that's done around here. So it's driven by measured data, and we don't have that measured data today. Right?
I was wondering, one question I thought I'd throw out to you guys, whoever wants to answer it, is there's a lot of irrigation management tools out there. So what distinguishes this one?
I'll let Andy field the water use portion, but I'd like to suggest that out of all the other tools we've seen or researched as possible competitors or models to learn from, I don't think we saw much about, if anything, about salinity management. So I know that to be one distinguishing factor.
That's precisely right. We want to address the salinity issue, and in order to address that, you need to keep track of the farm over multiple seasons. You've got to keep a checkbook and know what you've done in prior crops. So this application will allow you to keep track of that. And the second thing that we think is distinguishable is the plan for using satellite data. We're not there yet, but that's another aspect that will be distinct. And maybe most important is that we're developing it here specifically focused on Yuma farms. So we're going to use local data that we developed from our eddy covariance observations, calibrated for local conditions. That doesn't mean other applications couldn't do a great job. They might, but that's our goal, to serve this area, southwestern Arizona. That's its focus.
That's cool. Kind of a comment, cautionary comment, I would say, because I work with a relatively small analytics company, work with some of the major growers. We're exclusively focused on fresh produce. We've been working for the last couple of years with the University of California Farmers Extension on their crop managed irrigation scheduling tool in the Central Coast of California. And without being unfair, they don't have a lot of users. You know, they say on the website they have about 15,000 users, but frankly, anybody who talks to in production agriculture won't use it because it's not practical. But we've been working on this project to try to make it more usable. And so I was really glad to hear you guys mentioned open web APIs and you know, the issues of security, data sharing, who are my, you know, the balancing the complexity you said about users. And so I would just really encourage you guys to focus on making models, and you said that are really local and are built with growers and actual data, and maybe eventually putting cover crops in there, what have you. That's the really valuable stuff that nobody can replace. But then making that accessible, I would just say the challenge is with universities and as a recovering academic, I understand it. You want to build a full interface, an app, make it available, but kind of figure out what you're really good at and then share those kind of models out to the others in the private sector. For example, if we can build on what's already out there. Specifically, the challenge if you don't do that, what we found in California is growers don't want to put their data in more than one place. And if they have this other system where they have to enter all their planting data, it ain't going to happen. And you can try to make it as standardized as possible, but everybody's got their own flavor spreadsheet or what have you. So that's a big deal, and it just really lowers the barrier, raises the barrier. So
I'm very happy to hear all of this, by the way. This is a lot of the considerations we worried about along the way. And I've been in this business for 15 years, a little over 15 years now, and we've seen dozens of crop managed like systems built that just have the entire kitchen sink of tools available. So if you know how to use it and you know exactly what you want, it's very powerful, but the utility and adoption really falls off after a certain amount of time for sure.
And that's not to say you don't need an interface to demo it and get feedback. So I think what you guys are doing is great. I'm just being very cautionary for what we've seen. Paul and I have been talking about this a while. I look forward to talking to you guys about this. We want to see this kind of thing needs to happen to be successful.
No, I appreciate that feedback. And I do want to recognize in the back here, team from JV Farms, Matt McGuire and his team, and they've been just amazing at helping us with information, trialing stuff. And they're going to be some of the guinea pigs on this, but we heard that from them very strongly is we've got our systems and anything they're going to add to it needs to integrate with that really well. So